Hello, welcome back to the A Perfect Union podcast. This is episode 8. We've got a lot of momentum here going with just sort of piggybacking off of the journey that we took in episode 7, which really started to distill into this deeper level of choice. This choice to become the higher human, and what is the science of that? What is the science of zooming out and seeing what the real vote is? Not to diminish the importance of the actual election and voting for our representatives. That is, in fact, it becomes even more important when we see it in the proper context. But what informs that vote is the deeper vote, the vote to get woke in a capital W sort of sense, woke to our higher nature. We see ourselves as not just passionate beings, feeling beings, but rational beings. That's how we, whether consciously or not, we see what sets us apart from other species. And this is not taking away a certain level of reason or intellect or intelligence from any other species, but it's clear that humans have been allotted something different, something special, something that has given us this capacity to advance and develop in language and in technology and in culture in a way that we do not see anywhere else on the planet. There is something there. If we were to say that in some basic way, we have a capacity for reason which is exceptional and powerful. And yet, it seems as though we haven't matured into it. It's like we are caught between, as I was saying towards the end of the last episode, as we're seeing, oh my gosh, this denormalizing the insanity of culture, not just in recent times, not just in the last 4 years, but in a grand scale of this 2,500-year election process of, can humans become humans? Can humans really become the awakened, rational, harmonious, peaceful, loving, giving, in sync with nature and environment and one another, celebrating diversity, not just tolerating it, but celebrating it and enriching our society to go beyond being what I call a suiciety, where we act as though we want to live freely, but indeed our actions are almost suicidal. Our way of thinking, our way of being becomes almost self-destructive and implosive. And to use that analogy of the Titanic, it's really helpful, because whatever side of the boat you're on the same boat. And what is that boat? And we were calling it malware. Because if we don't think of it in terms of just physical nature and physical reality, but we see it as the reality of our soul, of our beings, we're living in a mind space. We're living in a rational space, which informs everything, including our physical actions and choices and everything else. So we've got to be able to see some pretty basic things here, guys, to get just even any progress. We have got to see that all that we experience, our feelings, our felt reality, our elections, our laws, our policies, the things that we think make the quality of our life, the external aspects of our life that we focus so much on, and you listen to the candidates speaking and how they're almost forced to have to address, okay, what am I going to do for you? Well, I'm going to address this policy and that policy, and we're so focused on the external as though that's what creates the quality of life. Meanwhile, all of that is being generated at a much more immediate level of the level of our consciousness practice. And if we don't see that, we're just going to end up exactly where we are, in these kind of extreme divisions, which are manifold, but can be distilled into like a positive, negative, plus, minus, us, them, communism, capitalism, left, right, Republican, Democrat, all these ways. It seems to kind of create this chasm that's in the middle, and that's how it's playing out. But what I'm asking, and what we're asking of you, is what is causing that? Because if we don't address that, then it's just one big, like a Super Bowl, us versus them, and which team is going to win, which team is going to muster up enough votes. And I mean, that's what's going on right now. There's an all-out war over just even the voting process, and one side trying to make it easier to vote, and one side trying to make it harder to vote. And what we're seeing is this literal playing out of the divisiveness that is the only way it can go. If we don't see the malware that all of us are laboring under. And that's what we're doing here. That's where you can only see that from the promised land. You can only see that from a perfect Unum union place. We've got to human up and activate our deeper rational capacity. In other words, if it's malware that we've been laboring under, this is the sourceware. This is the antidote to that, the antivirus software, mindware that's going to be what it really comes down to. And this is just what it is. So that's my opening thoughts as we ride this momentum here that we're on this morning, Dad. I'd like to hear how would you like to see this go from this point, having said what I've said?
Well, you spoke beautifully now to keep it the dialogue deepening. And the urgency of it, and the malware and the pandemic that's been, inherent in our human family across the planet, and invoking all of our great teachers and scriptures to address it. And that's the context. When you say zoom out, Nath, right? We're embedded every day. Take the everyday person and say the American cultural scene, and that's a local lab. But we're always zooming out to see the human condition, right? And when you say the malware, that's serious. Because what is the malware? It's how we're using our minds to make our lives and our world. And most people aren't even aware of that. In terms of our education, right? We're educated to get literacy and got information and know how to use language and make sense and describe the world and learn those skills of language. That's fantastic. But we don't stand back and say, well, what's going on? What logic? What mind operating process are we using to get this information? Right? The narratives we live by, our belief systems, our wishes, our hope, our whole psychic mental life is using a code of mental processing. People aren't aware of that we make our lives and our worlds, existence with how we're using our minds to process it. And if we're using, a stage of a rational, linguistic, mental, I call it mentation, all mental processing, development that is good so far as it goes to have information and so forth, but if it doesn't lead us to get to the source, to the Unum, that holds us together, and we can remain cut off from that, the best we're going to have is opinion. Belief on my terms, what I see, what seems true to me. And what seems true to me, I take to be true. And I can be in a cluster of millions sharing that perspective or that story and our collective wills. And it could still be cutting us off from in the malware. And therefore, it's an opinion nation, right? And what we saw and brought towards the end of this cannot go on because the culture, we make our culture with our mental coding. And if it's fragmenting and polarizing by its nature, it's not going to be sustainable. The economics, democracy, the voting, our institutions, everything is going to be in jeopardy. That's why this is deeper. This is the foundation of the nation itself, the culture itself. We must, when you say zoom out, have critical thinking, to step back and say, ask a question with our great teachers and scriptures. Have we stood back from privileging the lens we have to become lens sensitive, to gain lensitivity, to realize, OMG, I've been seeing you, world, self, everything from a mental space, a perspective, a lens that I wasn't aware of. I didn't have lensitivity.
And taking it to be ultimate.
I was seeing everything from and taking it to be ultimate. That's the virus right there. Right? When we're taking our opinion of what seems true to me and us and our shared homies to be reality and truth and fact, right? And we stand by it, and we don't know how to realize that others have different lenses and seeing different perspectives on reality. Where do they all come from? This is the big point, Nath. They come from the fundamental logos. But who is tapping that? Who is really, connected with the source and aware of the source? Are we aware of the logos? I'm using the word logos from the Greek, but the logos is across the planet. It's being itself. It's reason itself. It's intelligence itself. It's love itself. Whether you call it Allah or Yahweh or Om or Tao or Buddha nature or nature's God or God's nature or
reality.
Christ.
Yeah.
Reality. Right. Just using secular. America is experimenting with having a secular civic space. What's that? That's a logos rational space. Reason is secular, but it's sacred. Because because it's infinite. This is the whole point, Nath. When we zoom out, unless we zoom out, according to the great call of our great teachers and enlightened teachers calling us to awaken to the source of our life, we don't have to use religious language, right? But it's inscribed in the very foundation of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are endowed by nature's God, God's nature, source, logos. Let's use a logos word. All right, why? Because we want a global space. Because we now realize 250 years later that we're a multicultural society. We're multiracial. We're multi-perspective. We've got diversity to deal with. And yet we're one nation allegedly under God, under source, indivisible. We don't have to use God talk because the word religion can pull us into a divisive sectarian space. It is itself a symptom, right? But still, when you use the word reason, that's the liberator, because reason, we're all rational beings.
Mm-hmm. And we're all accountable to being rational.
Exactly, but that's what a rational being is. Critical thinking, accountable to reason, which means reason is first, which is what the logos is first. The law is first. That's the law of the land, not the laws that we made. So it's extremely important. Everything we've done in episodes 1 through 9 is to show and make the case to show that if you really listen deeply to the 1776 Declaration founding, that we hold these truths to be self-evident. And all that was saying in our episode 1, right, that is moving and tapping the logos. The founders are not the individuals themselves, but what they were tapping in tapping the logos. And that was a great breakthrough in the Holy Experiment that could lead to a democratic republic of one nation under source indivisible, which we've not yet entered into. Why? Because we've not done our homework as critical, rational beings to pay attention to how we're using our minds and the malware that leads to opinion-ism and truth by numbers on our terms, according to our will. And if we put our wills first, and our vote is our will, is our belief, when we believe something, we're using our will. We're voting. We're saying, I believe it. I choose it. I affirm it. And people have to realize that you're exercising your will. But the great wisdom teaches not reality on my terms, but reality on source terms, objective reality, logos. And Nathan, if there's one insight that I've seen over decades of listening to these great teachers as a logician and ontologist, science of being, it's that the infinite is the source of all possible worlds, all narratives, all religions, all ideologies, all perspectives, all humans. Being, that's the whole point. First science, source science, logos science. I use the word, it's infinitely secular. It's beyond any particular religion. You don't have to use God words, right, to understand being. Reality is infinite. You can't bind it, and you can't multiply it and divide it. It's infinitely one. There is a perfect Unum. That's our podcast. That's the perfect Unum. So if you go east and you go into the yoga and you go Om and Brahman and you try using that technology to get to communion with Unum, Om is logos. Or you go to Tao in ancient Chinese wisdom. The Tao is an alternative name for the infinite force, the infinite source. And it's going to be the logos. So logos has infinite names. And we shouldn't just put them in silos. You can't. The source of Unum, the source of rational light, and therefore the moral law, is that the Unum pluribus. Logos is Unum pluribus, diversity in unity, unity in diversity. Infinite universe. That's the foundation of 1776, the foundation of Christ, right? Jesus was tapping the Logos, and the Logos in the flesh, as John said. Logos is speaking, right? But if we're using our ego-mental malware of informationism, this is the other point I'd like to throw back for you to bring out, that what's mal about the malware? Well, information describing the world is using a code, right, that cuts us off from source. To gain information-ism, right? My perspective, my narrative, my truth, my facts, according to my lens, right? We have to put the lens factor in there, right? Information-ism cut off from source becomes disinformational. Because the narratives that if I even like cluster with others in a community of belief and share belief on our terms, right, it is not putting the Logos first, objective reality and truth as rational beings. And therefore it's opinion. And when you take opinion to be truth, right, that is the break from being sane and rational. And you can't found a culture that's sustainable on opinionism. So when we say we hold these truths to be self-evident, right, that you've got to get to the Logos. That's what makes Jesus true. Jesus is true for the Christians, right? We have to face this. If I'm a monocentric Christian on my terms, and I'm reading the gospel and narratives in informationized space and not in Logos space, that's the difference. The Logos code is the missing code for us, for all humanity, across the planet, however you come it. If it's Allah, well, Allah is first. That is the Allah name for Logos, Yahweh name for Logos, Om name for Logos, right? They're all infinite, and they have universal jurisdiction, and in that respect, they're secular. What is secular? It's not an ideology. The call of 1776 is a call to awaken to the Logos that grants us our unalienable rights of life, liberty, well-being. And that's a holy experiment. Can we do that? And the crisis we're now facing right now, then, is showing that we are imploding. We're unsustainable. And we have to say why. And that's what started in this conversation. What's going on at the deeper level? And you're calling us to zoom out, step back, right? Look at 2,500 years, see how the Logos, the Unum pluribus, that's the big thing. People don't understand the depth of what we say, e pluribus unum, out of the many one, out of the diversity, unity, one nation under source. That's the promised land. That space, right? The land is not physical land. It's the mental space of what code are we using? Are we tapping into the Logos code of reason and stepping into our nature as LogoSapien rational beings? Or are we remaining separated in informationism, in a derivative code that's cut off and desourced, and which is inherently fragmenting and leading to ideology and ideologism and sophistry, taking what seems to be true to be truth? That's a grave, ancient problem that we have not come to terms with yet. Could we still be in sophistry, taking appearance to be real, spin doctors, to make our narrative appear true on our terms? Truth for me is not truth for the source. That's the malware issue. So in effect, what we've pointed out in 1 through 9, that there are two profoundly different codes. The one that dominates informationism, A is A, Lego land, Lego pieces. We don't realize that when we use that code, we make everything into separate units and separate pieces. And it's going to be is or isn't. It's going to be bivalent, either or. And from that source, as a dominant culture code that we're using to make our lives and our culture and our democracy, it's going to be polarizing and lead to opinionism and ideology and the breakdown that we're facing. That's the pandemic that we've got to see. We haven't seen it yet now.
Yes, and we have to connect that to, because if you don't see that science that you just beautifully distilled for us, you can't see the source of tyranny and authoritarianism, fascism, and any form of dictatorship. Think about the word dictator implies dictation, right? Speaking, narrative. And so we talk about versions of supremacy. Obviously, we've all heard of white supremacy, but we could say that that's the problem. No, that's a symptom of what? Narrative supremacy. In other words, if you're in opinionism, the question obviously becomes, well, which opinion rules, right? Because in lieu of the ruling principle of Logos, Well, then someone's got to fill that vacuum. And then you've got, okay, well, I'm sure as heck not going to let your opinion rule me. So it becomes a narrative supremacy war. The malware leads inevitably and consistently throughout history, and we've got endless examples of this. Narrative supremacy is the name of the game. Might makes right. What you declare, who is going to dictate? What? Dictate reality. So if you can understand that okay, you can say the monarchy. We got rid of the monarchy. We're not a monarchy, but you could be a triarchy, as we said a few episodes back. What if you stacked the supposedly 3 co-equal branches of government and the checks and balances that they provide to keep us from going into authoritarianism? What if they become themselves stacked under the insistence of a narrative side, and then become tools to be another version of dictatorship made up of 3 branches, and you've got a triarchy instead of a monarchy, right? So we've got to understand where does this any form of dictatorship, which is what? Which is to suppress the true human being, the true nature, to suppress freedom. And it's not, one of the things I've said before that really kind of says it in a very simple, easy to get way is that the master of the slave is not free. It's not like the dictator in his or her sitting in his or her crown, throne with the crown is free and liberated while the people suffer under their rule. The whole thing is enslaved, right? The master and the slave are both enslaved. If either one of them is more free, it's the slave. And I think we fail to see that because we fail to see the essence of slavery, the essence of the lack of freedom, or the essence of authoritarianism takes place in each and every one of our consciousnesses. That's the malware. The malware is the source of authoritarianism. And because it's cutting us off, as you said beautifully, I almost wanted to recap that before it slipped away. I'm glad I remembered. All information, all objectified information subjected to the lens, the desourced lens, the malware, in that space, no matter how good your information seems to adhere to reality as it is, facts, no matter how good your facts may be, if they're desourced, all information is disinformation. All information. That's a bold thing to say. I get it, but I'm not saying that there is not fact and there is not truth. But what I'm saying is we've got to take it higher. If we've got to honor the source of validity, right? We can't have validity just on our terms because see what happens is, well, you've got alternative facts. I don't care how good your facts are. This pandemic has made that so glaring. The scientists are saying, we're going to listen to the scientists, one side says, and the other side is like, well, we've got our own scientists with our own reality, our own narrative. Perfect, glaring example of even if your information is good, even if your track record is stellar in terms of being a public servant, and I do believe we have that, in broad daylight. And I'm trying not to name names, but I'm trusting that you, from what I'm saying, you can know who I'm talking about. We have public servants who are clearly not in it for politics, and they're in it to help the people be safe, and so they're and you can trust them more for delivering the more grounded information, right? The more grounded information, the facts that we should listen to and organize around, right? But guess what? It's not working. We're split, we're divided over the facts, over the reality, over the science. How could that possibly be? This is how it can be. The malware, the same boat principle, which is that even if we have a side that seems to be adhering to reality more and listening to the science and seems to be more sane, seems to be more interested in caring for ourselves and one another, which seems to be the more sane way to be, even then we seem to be going down on the same boat. So in other words, guys, we've got to get wiser. We've got to get smarter here and understand that even good information can be desourced cut off from the source of validity. And that's the promised land. If we want to get to the promised land, we've got to upgrade our consciousness, is another way of saying, call out that malware, activate the antivirus sourceware, mindware. And so that's some of my thoughts in response to what you're saying, and I think it's a really hot topic and almost too hot to handle, too controversial to say. All information is disinformation. And in lieu, and if we don't see that, then all we can have is authoritarianism, dictatorship in one way, shape, or form. Even if we're just dictated, our realities are dictated by the lack of Unum, lack of union. The chaos is the dictator, the lack of, in any way, shape, or form. If we are desourced as a people, we're colonized, right? So, it's just again to say that there's nothing more important than for each of us to get this education that we never got. We said the Pledge of Allegiance all those years in school. Most of us just saying it by rote and not even really meaning it. You say it, why? Because you're supposed to, right? We sing the national anthem at the beginning of a sports game, and we've got this pride, but do we really understand what it's asking of us? We're in a place where will the flag still be there, and the bombs are still bursting in air right now, and the narrative bombs, and it's not looking good. And I'm not being a pessimist or a cynic by saying that. It's actually quite the opposite. It is not looking good. And it's an emergency for us to get this.
So, Nath, what the point about colonized, we're colonized, that's a very striking thing to say, because we pride ourselves on being leaders of the free world and land of the free. And one of our episodes 1 through 9, we said we are the land of ideology, which is not a good thing. It means we're lodged in malware. That's what makes an ideology a malpractice of the mind and makes it pernicious and cultic and tribal, monocentric, narcissistic. All of these words, right? We're self-contained within our own lens, and we're not aware of it enough. We must become aware, and to zoom out critically as mental development, rational development requires us to become aware of the lens and how we make our world with our minds. And then to see why we're suffering so many widespread disorders in our culture. Not just the meltdown of voting and democracy and our institutions of democracy, but our whole cultural fabric of life with that mental processing and what we're calling the malware of the mind, which is what? Cut off from the source. So in a way, looking back at the founding, right, we hold these truths to be self-evident and the Declaration of Independence. What was the independence? Well, obviously, it was to break away from the monarchy. The British rule, break away from that and be independent of that. No, that was part one. That's not what the Declaration was saying. It says if at any point, any conventions or contracts, so to speak, that bring people to bind to one another, right, violates our independence and freedom and dignity and life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, our God-given rights, our source, Logos-given rights, if at any point in our shared self-governance that happens, it's not just an external, it's the internal monarch, the internal tyrant. It comes back to the code itself. The code that dominates our thinking and our interpretation and our self-making and world-making and life-making, if that is tainted and cut off from the source, it's going to be malware. That's what defines it as malware. That's the deep structure of tribalism, cultism, opinion-ism, right? Me-ism, rather than source, rather than logos, rather than rationality. And we cannot survive as a culture this way. It's clear. The culture needs the health of rational, which is a place of love and moral consciousness. Why? Because we go from I-it life. The information code that dominates our culture making objectifies everything, objectifies ourselves. And the greatest insight of ethics, don't treat a person as an object. Don't objectify, right? A person. A person, again, life, liberty, well-being. It takes persons to have a democracy. That's the polis, the sacred polis of a community that USA has not yet become, is a place of persons, first persons, who are in touch with the Logos, with the code, and therefore coming and maturing as rational beings. Otherwise, we remain colonized by a matrix, a grammar, a logic, a mind operating process that is an immature technology of making our lives, which is tainted, and that's a pandemic that we must face. And this is going to be opening up for further conversations now.
Absolutely.
To understand. If you don't understand where we are, we can't face the virus.
Exactly. And guys, while we're saying we haven't done it, we're not the leaders of the free world. In the same breath, I want to end on this note. And we can be, and we are, because we're not going to get to the magnitude and depth of what it means to become a true democracy, a we the people, and have it be authentic and not take it for granted if we don't earn it. We shouldn't, in other words, while denormalizing the insanity, as I've called us to do again and again in these last 2 episodes, it can lend itself to being disheartening and discouraging and woe is me and woe is us and even embarrassing. There's something healthy to denormalizing the insanity and going, wow, this is pretty bad, and whoa, we don't deserve to say we're the leaders of the free world, in a kind of transitional sense. But I want to end on a very positive, optimistic note, which is, and that's perfect. That's it. If we're going to get to where we need to be, we do have to go through what we're going through now. And so I wanted to leave you on this note of don't feel disheartened. Don't feel discouraged. Know that we are right on track. It is an emergency, and there is a profound urgency akin to the Titanic going down, but it's joy. And when people use the word hope, you can say that in a kind of hopeful thinking, which is kind of weak, anemic, but hope, real hope is not just hope that we might get there. It's the hope that comes from presiding and residing in the promised land, which is joy, which is love, which is understanding and compassion, and we have direct access to that. But if we're laboring under the malware, we can't. And we can't have homeland security, a sense of security, if we don't have source, if we don't have the logos, if we don't do our homework, we can't have homeland security, And if we are insecure, we're going to be fight or flight. If we're in fight or flight, we're going to be in battle mode, and we're going to be at arms. So the remedy for all of this, guys, spread the good news, spread the good word here. We have direct access to the homeland, to the promised land, to the place of reason and sanity and goodness and love. It's right here. There's nothing blocking us but the malware we didn't know was there, but now we've called it out. And we can now, it's the most hopeful of hopeful times ever. So thank you for joining us in this journey. We will continue to resonate these vibrations for you in the coming weeks and days and months. See you next time.